Okay, sorry for the extended silence. I am attempting to do something that I haven't done before, which is to simulcast live on both YouTube and X. However, it's not working. Does not appear to be anything connect. Oh no, now I can see. All right. So this is an experiment precisely because there has been a new foundation institute. The Conjecture Institute has been formed. By Naval Ravikant and is being steered primarily by Logan Chipkin and some others, but Logan Chipkin is the main guy. And as part of this initiative, the purpose of which is essentially a kind of philanthropic way of helping with research across diverse areas, primarily science focused, and within that largely physics, but not only. The intention of the Conjecture Institute is to support people who otherwise might be hampered by searching for other means of support, by which I mean the traditional university and academic institutions. So the Conjecture Institute is going to be something very, very, very different. And as part of that, I'm going to help out by introducing some of the fellows, so-called, of the Conjecture Institute, the people who are being funded and being promoted by the Conjecture Institute for doing anything from working at the foundations of physics, research in AGI, making documentaries, making art. So there's a diverse series of projects that are being worked on by this new Conjecture Institute. And in order for us to help it get out there, we're going to do some live streams. So this is me, just on my regular channel, trying to make sure the software works. I don't know if it is or not, but hey, let's just see how we go. Well, apparently I have chat messages. Lucas. Hi, it's Deb. Yeah. Hi. So that must be coming through on... Is that from YouTube or is it from somewhere else? So I can see message. You type me a message, and if you're there, and then I'll answer it. So for today, I thought I will, if I'm going to just appear, I may as well not be silent the entire time. Let's just talk about something worth talking about, and which absolutely took over Twitter, X, over the last week, was Douglas Murray's appearance on Joe Rogan with comic Dave Smith. I don't really want to add to the noise about that. It was a huge issue on social media and on regular media as well. I mean, it really made the headlines everywhere. And I still just cannot understand. I cannot understand why there is a lack of moral clarity on this issue, because it's not a complicated issue. There is the Enlightenment and the West. There are people who support democracy, free speech, and capitalism, all of the wonderful things that allow for a flourishing civilization. And then there is a culture which is antagonistic to all of those things. And right now they are in deep conflict, not because the proponents of the Enlightenment attacked those who were anti-Enlightenment, but the other way around. In 2023, on October 7, Hamas entered Israel and massacred a vast number of people and kidnapped a whole bunch more. They waged a war. There was a ceasefire until then. There were no Israeli soldiers, no IDF in Gaza at that time. There hadn't been for many years. And yet, when that happened, when that atrocity happened, far from people in our societies, the United States, across Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, immediately taking the side of Israel, although there were, of course, a large number of people who did that, it was astonishing the number of people who took the other side, who sided with those who stated They wanted to commit genocide, tried to commit genocide, and were partially successful in doing so, as in they committed mass murder, but not quite genocide. But they would have if they could have. Sam Harris has made this point about what would you do with the perfect weapon, if you had the perfect weapon. And Naval Ravikant has recently talked about what I would regard as something close to the perfect weapon. He's talking about the future of warfare. And the future of warfare might very well come down to drones, miniature drones. Drones so small they're no bigger than a bullet. They could travel as fast as a bullet and could be directed using artificial intelligence or by a human operator to kill whoever you want. You wouldn't even see the thing coming. It could come buzzing in like a mosquito into your house and kill you. And so in the distant dystopian future that we're imagining, not quite dystopian actually, but in a future that we're imagining where wars can be waged with drones the size of mosquitoes that can be deadly, what would Hamas do with a drone army like that? A swarm of drones, millions of drones, all of which, each of which, could be a deadly bullet directed perfectly towards a target. Well, we know what they'd do, because they've said what they'd do. The first thing they'd do is they'd kill everyone in Israel. They'd kill all the Jews in Israel and everyone else who's there. That's what they'd do. What would Israel do if they possessed this drone army? They wouldn't exterminate anyone. They've never wanted to exterminate anyone. They've tried to avoid, at every opportunity, killing innocent people. But because of the use of human shields, it is impossible, physically impossible, for them to not have collateral damage in the attempt to kill. If I say physically impossible, at the moment with the level of knowledge we have, physically impossible not to kill innocent people. I say innocent, people who voted for Hamas largely, in their attempt to kill Hamas. So what would they do with the perfect drone army? What would Israel do? They would kill the terrorists, and only the terrorists. That would be it. And the war would be over, because you'd no longer have any terrorists. You wouldn't be able to wage a terrorist war. There is a black and white difference between the stated aims of the state of Israel and the IDF and Hamas and the broader Palestinian population and what they think one of the other. So this clear line between the Enlightenment on the one hand and anti-Enlightenment on the other, how it is lost and how it is confused, I don't know. But Douglas Murray is one of the most eloquent, powerful speakers on the side of Israel, and has been since the beginning of the conflict. And yet, he was an expert, of course, on the history of the Middle East long before October 7, 2023. It's been his business to inform himself about the history of conflicts around the world, the Enlightenment and anti-Enlightenment forces. Some people came to an interest in the Israel-Palestine conflict in that area of the world on October 7, 2023. That's when they decided that they would take an interest in it. And upon taking an interest in it, they thought, well, I won't just take the mainstream view being it was a terrorist attack where over 1,000 people were killed and many were kidnapped back to Gaza. I'm not going to take the side of, it's too easy to take the good side. Nothing is ever black and white. Many things are black and white. Many things are black and white. There's a distinct difference between good and evil, between positive and negative, and so on. But these people, these people who decided they would become experts on the history of the Middle East on October 7, 2023, decided, I will be a contrarian. I'll be a contrarian. That's the intelligent take. There must be a reason why Israel was attacked. They must be culpable in some way. Therefore, because of something that's happened in the past, it is legitimate for Hamas to have done what they did. Or a slightly more watered down version of that is, I won't excuse what happened on October 7th. What Hamas did was an atrocity. However, the response ever since, not proportional. And so we've heard this to and fro a lot, this lack of proportionality, and as Douglas Murray's eloquently pointed out over and again. What would proportional mean? Would proportional mean the IDF goes in and just randomly kills a whole bunch of people at a dance party in Gaza, rapes a whole bunch of girls, and then drags back to Israel, kidnaps a whole bunch more otherwise innocent people? But that's not what proportional is, and proportionality is not what we're after. We're after justice. We're after getting hostages back. So this is the point that Douglas has been making over and over again. All that has to happen, many people have made, all that has to happen is for Hamas to release the hostages. The fighting will stop. Possibly you need to also have what remains of Hamas brought to justice, thrown in jail most likely, if not killed, and then something figured out with that region. What happens after? No one knows exactly what's going to happen after, but it can't be that you have a terrorist state, namely a state in the form of Palestine, Gaza, that has its stated aim of destroying the other one, its neighbour, Israel. Israel does not have a stated aim anywhere, has not tried to destroy that country. But over and again, over the years, this is precisely what the people in Palestine have done. And they've elected people who've said that this is what they want to do. Let me just check if my messages are still coming through. Oh, good. YouTube chat. Okay, so that works. And I think I'm going out on X as well. Yes, that seems to be working too. So, in this circumstance, we have, 18 months later, a number of people, intellectuals, public influencers and so on, who have strongly, if not explicitly, taken the side of Hamas and the terrorists, have not taken the side of Israel. They have not supported Israel. They've been mealy-mouthed at best, and at worst, explicitly Nazi-like. So what did we see on Joe Rogan when Douglas Murray went on there to talk about his book on democracies and death cults, and he came up against a comedian, erstwhile comedian perhaps, because I don't know what his comedy's like. All I've ever seen is him talk about Israel and Palestine. And this fellow, Dave Smith's there on Joe Rogan. And again, he's one of these people who seems utterly confused between what is good and what is bad, who initiates the violence, who's trying to stop the violence, who are the terrorists and who aren't. And as always in these situations, what happens? It's so predictable. A person like Dave Smith challenges Douglas Murray with, well, what about the dead babies? What about the genocide? What about the open-air prison? All of these tropes, these utter lies, by the way. And it's an interesting move to make. You see at one point there, when he brings up dead babies, before he does, he says to Douglas, I have children. I don't know if you have children. Joe, do you have children? I know you've got children. So it's a very subtle way of saying, I've got children and therefore care about children. Joe, you've got children and you care about children. But Douglas, you don't. He knew Douglas didn't have kids. He knew. And so he said, you don't have, do you have children? But telling the audience, there's only two of us here who have children. So we care about children. Douglas over there, childless Douglas, cannot possibly care about children. And so therefore, of course, he's on the side of Israel, because what is Israel doing, according to Dave Smith and many others? Recklessly killing children by the tens of thousands, apparently, if you believe the Gaza Health Ministry, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. This move to appeal to dead children is absurd, absolutely absurd at the face of it. No one wants to see dead children. All of the blame for dead children falls on the side of Hamas. Dave Smith says to Douglas, what would you do if you were in Palestine? What would you do if your baby has been killed or is laying under the rubble and is dying? Wouldn't you become a terrorist? Basically, he's implying that it is the worst possible thing. How could you justify this in any way? What is the possible stance you could take? Now, the thing with that line of argument, and you hear it again and again and again as a tedious refrain from the people who will do anything, will go through any sort of linguistic and philosophical gymnastics in order to avoid saying that Israel is doing its possible best to avoid dead children. What do these people never do who talk about dead babies and talk about genocide? They never flip it around. They never flip it around and say, imagine what you would do, what you would be driven to if you were an Israeli whose family had been killed on October 7, whose daughter had been raped, whose son had been kidnapped back to Gaza, and the only other family member you had was just murdered outright. What would you do in that circumstance? No, they never ask that question. They always say, what would you do as the poor Palestinian denizen whose child is now beneath the rubble? Ooh, you'd be upset, but what you should do is blame Hamas, and many of them are. It is only now, well, not only, okay, but it's largely a vast number of people in the West, from Australia through to the United States and all across Europe, who are doing what they can to say that Israel is the one who is making the illegitimate moves, that it is Israel in defending itself that is committing the error, that committed the first error. But all of this debate about Israel's tactics, Israel's attempt to minimise the number of civilian casualties, and by the way, the number of combatants, as has been reported widely, the number of combatants killed to the number of civilians killed in this particular conflict is approximately 1 to 1. So for every combatant, one civilian is killed, unfortunately. But that ratio is apparently the best that has ever existed in any war ever in the history of humankind. Ever. It was way higher during the Iraq War, way higher during the Vietnam, Korea, World War II, World War I, and before that. People would just routinely wipe out the civilian populace. That's not what's happening in this case. We know that they're not trying to commit a genocide. We know that Israel's not trying to commit a genocide because they could if they wanted to. But instead, the population of Gaza has increased. Population of Gaza has increased. But let's zoom out, and this is what I wish would happen more often. And far be it from me to ever give advice to Douglas Murray, but if caught in this situation again, I think that this is an argument that I haven't heard enough. But there's a lot of arguments that Douglas could make. I could never have done as good a job as what Douglas did, certainly, on Joe Rogan there. Measured, calm, collected for the most part. The argument that I want to make is to zoom out from this conflict. Zoom out from this conflict, historically speaking. And look at the history of Judaism and Jews since they began. What, 2.5, 3,000 years ago, something like that. What has happened to that group of people, that ethnicity, that religion, ever since? We have a word for it. Pogrom. Pogrom. There have been repeated pogroms against the Jews, unlike with any other ethnicity that exists on planet Earth. There have been some similarities, but there's a specific thing with Jews. There have been attempts to wipe them out over and again. There have been attempts to mass murder them, to legitimise the violence against them over and again and again and again across thousands of years. You just look, anyone can look this up, can look up the history of it. In Russia in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, pogroms against the Jews, eruptions of violence. All over Eastern Europe after World War I. It culminated, it reached a crescendo, a violent crescendo, in World War II with Hitler. That's just the most famous one. But anyone who's interested in this needs to look at the long history of this. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, in Syria in 1834, pogrom, attempt to wipe out the Jewish population there. There have been these repeated attempts to wipe out the Jews across the world. The largest such one was in World War II, but there have been many others since, or before that. And so when you zoom out and you look at this long pattern and you think to yourself, who am I at any of those historical epochs? Jordan Peterson talks about this and says, don't think too grandly of yourself. Don't think too grandly. If you were a German in Nazi Germany during, from 1939 to 1945, don't think you're so great that you wouldn't have been one of the people that would have been drawn into the Nazi party, unless you've got very strong moral fibre. And so here we are now in 2025, but throughout 2024, and you have to think, zooming out, who are you? What side are you on? Knowing the history, knowing what happened not only in World War II, but in every pogrom before that. Because we're in a pogrom now, and as David Deutsch says, the pogrom is continually getting worse. It's getting worse. There are eruptions of violence throughout the world, on the streets of Sydney, where I am, New York, France, London, these places in the West that are supposed to be safe. Now, knowing that these pogroms have happened from time to time and seem to occur with some kind of pattern, David Deutsch talks about the pattern, it's technically defined though, because this has happened over and again, it demonstrates that the Jews have not been safe in Europe, in America at certain points, throughout the Middle East more broadly. And so what had to happen? What had to happen in 1947 was the creation of a new state, which was just a codification of a state that had already existed there. The Jews had historic ties to this particular land, Israel, for thousands of years. So because it was clear that they weren't safe from extermination in Europe, well, likely anywhere else, they created a very tiny little state there that's now called Israel. And ever since then, it's sort of been etched away as they have conceded things to the people who want to exterminate them. Here you have a little bit more land, here you have a little bit more land there, even though Israel actually won wars where the state, they attempted to destroy the state again throughout various other wars, the other countries surrounding them, Egypt, Syria, Iran, various people tried to destroy Israel over the years since it was created. They failed to do so. And so given all of this, you now find yourself in 2025, and you, as a Western enlightened person, so-called, decide to take the side of Hamas, one of the most genocidal organisations that has ever existed. That many people can make the case worse than the Nazis. Worse than the Nazis. I made a video called The Pattern soon after October 7. And a point I made there, and since then I've heard various other people make it as well, is that at least what you could say about the Nazis was that they seemed, in some sense, some of them, to be ashamed of what they did and were doing in exterminating the Jews. They didn't want anyone to know about it. It was a shameful thing. Say many things about German society, but their philosophy was not one of, pro-genocide. Let's celebrate genocide. It wasn't that. And so they had operating on, the hardware of their brain, a certain kind of memeplex that said, genocide not good. Don't celebrate this. We did it, okay? There's a sense in which we don't regret it, but we're not going to celebrate it. That's the Nazis. Willing to engage in genocide, but kind of, not happy that they had to do so, sort of a necessary evil in their mind. Hamas, on the other hand, thinks that this is a wonderful thing and they're going to celebrate it, and they did celebrate it on October 7th. So by that measure, worse than the Nazis. And so if you find yourself perhaps not supporting Hamas, but insufficiently supporting Israel at this moment, you have to have a good hard look at yourself and do what the ideas are that are driving your utterances and your behaviour. So these are my reflections on what Douglas had to say to Dave Smith. I think that we need to take a more historic view at the moment in order to counter this, because as much as, yes, we need to focus on the Israel-Gaza conflict, it is just the latest, the present instance of something that is much wider, longer, ongoing. We want to stop it. People said never again. Well, here is the time of never again. And it's not just Dave Smith, who's a comedian, who's just saying stuff. And it's not just Joe Rogan, who is, okay, that terrible word platforming, and it's fair enough. I don't mind that Joe Rogan has someone like Dave Smith on. It's just that I agree with Douglas Murray that you need to have many more people to counter the growing number of loud voices out there, including on Joe's podcast, that, again, if they're not pro-genocide and pro-Hamas, they're insufficiently supportive of Israel. Now, why should you be supportive of Israel? Again, because not only of the long history that I just talked about, and knowing that Israel is the one safe place for Jews, or at least should have been, but because they are an outpost of the Enlightenment and of Western values, of democracy, of free speech, of free trade, of all those error correction mechanisms. They are, in fact, one of the few shining beacons over there in the Middle East of that, and we should support that. And the other side is a genocidal terrorist organisation, and even the people who don't belong to Hamas voted for Hamas, and many of them are still supportive of the things that Hamas is doing and so on. But you have not only Dave Smith, you have someone who's worse. And I actually used to listen to this guy because he was on Jocko Willink, who I respect highly, but Daryl Cooper. And I didn't realise Daryl Cooper was basically sort of such an anti-Western guy. It's unfortunate, but it turns out he's sort of, plays with the Nazi ideas, and he doesn't have a coherent moral explanation about how the world actually operates. But when you're willing to say that just maybe Winston Churchill was a bad guy, Hitler wasn't great, but it's not like Winston Churchill was a hero, you're confused. You're suffering a form of moral relativism that doesn't clarify anything, it only muddies the waters. There is a categorical difference between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, and if someone like Daryl Cooper can't understand that difference, that there is a hero in that conflict and a villain, because morality is like that. Let's just put it out there, okay? All of this sophistication about moral relativism and, it depends upon what culture you come from, it depends upon what set of facts that you decide to elevate and which one you try and... Forget all that. Forget all of that. One thing traditional religion has right is that there is a difference between good and evil. If you are raping children, you're evil. There is no excuse. There's no let's try and conjure this in such a way as to cast these people as victims of the culture. Though they are, that doesn't change the fact that's evil. It's easy. This is not a hard question. And so if you're confused about whether or not Winston Churchill was a good guy or a bad guy, you need better philosophy. You need better capacity to reason. Because what you've done somehow or other is confuse yourself by selectively picking, cherry picking as it's called, facts about, let's say, what happened during the time that Winston Churchill was in charge of England, the United Kingdom and the Allies during World War II. And you selectively figure out that, some bad things happen in India. And so you're going to selectively elevate that and suppress all the bad, terrible things that the Nazis did while saying that Winston Churchill did all of these terrible, nasty things. And so, as Douglas Murray says, you can kind of equalise the two. Hitler, Winston Churchill, they're kind of very similar. And then you make the move and you say, well, actually, the way everyone has thought about this conflict is actually the wrong way around. Because the Soviet Union came out of the Second World War, that means that actually Winston Churchill and the Allies were the bad people. And if only Hitler had have been allowed to win, maybe we wouldn't have had the Soviet Union and so on. Absolutely confused. Absolutely confused about our incapacity to predict the future. No one wanted communism to gain the foothold that it did, but that does not change the fact Winston Churchill stopped Hitler. Winston Churchill had the right intentions. Winston Churchill was the one who was on the side of democracy and spreading democracy and free speech and free trade. He was the one that was for that. And he defeated the person who was against all that. And just because there's someone else over there in the Soviet Union who happened to be also against all of those things does not change the fact that he's the good guy and Hitler's the bad guy. That's it. End of story, full stop. It's not, but people want to make this more complicated than it is. As people want to make Russia and Ukraine more complicated than it is. On the one hand, a clear dictator, Putin, and on the other, a wartime president who was democratically elected. Of course he hasn't had elections. It's a little bit hard to have an election during a war. While the missiles are raining down upon schools, you're going to set up election booths? What are people thinking? How does that work? How do you have an election in the middle of a war when half of your male populace is on the front line, can't vote anyway? And the other half are fleeing the country. What are the logistics of this? What part of the government is going to run this so-called election? That's simple. The Ukrainians are on the side of right and democracy and free speech and all of that stuff, and Russia is absolutely against it. Israel, Palestine. Clear difference between good and evil there. Yes, good and evil. Good and evil. This is why many of us like, forget about traditional religion, books like The Lord of the Rings. There's no moral confusion why we think it's something better than like Game of Thrones. You watch Game of Thrones and or a certain other modern kind of fantasy books. The morality is confused. One of the reasons people argue that George R.R. Martin hasn't actually finished Game of Thrones is because he doesn't have a clear morality. He doesn't understand the difference between good and evil, so he can't figure out how to end it. Whereas Tolkien always knew, J.R.R. Tolkien knew there's this dark lord, evil person, and there's the forces of good. There's a clear distinction between people like that kind of thing. It's like Harry Potter. You've got the villain, you've got the good person. This is really how the world works. But people want to say, oh, no, well, maybe Voldemort had a point. Maybe Sauron had a point. Maybe Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader had a point. This is the people who, in this world, say that Hamas might have a point. The Palestinians might have a point. Hitler might have had a point. They've been let down by an education system, I suppose, that hasn't been able to effectively figure out how to allow them to figure out truth from falsity, good explanations from bad explanations, sense from nonsense, and all of that. So, not only do you have, Daryl, you've got people like Candace Owens, who's out there every other day complaining about how Jesus was killed by the Jews and just the general, she's become a Nazi. Tucker Carlson, playing the I'm just asking questions game all the time. These are large platforms, people who have a lot to say, but they never grapple with what the Enlightenment is. They never grapple with what Western culture really is. They don't have an understanding of that. They're weak isolationists. They're tribal. I say they're weak because they're not willing to actually stand up for anything on principle. They just sort of say in a nebulous way, oh, I'm pro-United States. Well, what does that mean? What is the United States? What is it? It's a set of ideas. It's not just a borders around a country. It's a set of ideas, principles, like the First Amendment. You're standing up for free speech and freedom and liberty for all. And you have to accept that, as much as I would defend Australia, there is such a thing as allies. There is such a thing as a common set of ideas, memes, understandings, which unify people that might not be in the same country, but come from the same culture and belong to the Enlightenment tradition. But these people who are anti-Ukraine, anti-Israel, they're confused about all of that. They don't really know what they're standing for, and there's a level of audience capture. I get that, because there are so many people who are young people who have been taught to hate their own country, especially in the United Kingdom, especially in the United States, Australia, Canada. They're told, don't like your colonial history, don't like your country. And so these young minds are susceptible to being told, Winston Churchill might not have been a good guy, and the Israelis might have a similar culture to what we do in the United Kingdom or America or whatever, a culture more like ours than what the people in Gaza do or the people in Iran do. But that doesn't mean that what is going on over there is as clear-cut as us simply supporting people who share our ideals, because they're killing babies, and that's all you need to say. That's the trump card. The IDF is killing babies, end of story. The IDF are not trying to kill babies. The IDF, Hamas killed babies, deliberately went out seeking them. But of course, it's hard to know how to talk to some of these people anyway, because if you try to sort of just calmly say that there's a difference in intention between these two, and if, as Sam Harris rightly points out, I'll go back to it again, says something, if they had the perfect weapon, if the Israelis had the perfect weapon, what would they do with it? And if Hamas had the perfect weapon, what would they do with it? Hamas would commit genocide against all the Jews. Israel would use the perfect weapon to avoid killing any innocent people, would go after the terrorists and the terrorists only, and save the hostages. Then it would end the conflict. Hamas would, with this perfect weapon, wipe out the Jews. That's what they want to do. They state they want to do that. And then they wouldn't just stop at Israel. It begins with the Jews and then it goes elsewhere. It'd go to the Christians next. Okay. I think that's all I had to say. Like, if this was just a test to see if this works. So it appears to have worked. I'll answer some questions. People have actually asked questions, so that's cool. Let's see. Difference between being a contrarian and using critical rationalism, maybe being a contrarian. Yeah, yes. Okay, so I'll be more eloquent in reading this person's good question. Difference between being a contrarian and using critical rationalism. Maybe being a contrarian entails opposing others' views for the sake of it without necessarily having a rational reason. Absolutely correct. That's right. That's what a contrarian is. All a contrarian is someone who tries to gain popularity by saying, I am so erudite and such a unique and special thinker, I'm going to take the opposing view on whatever the topic is, usually in the modern age of social media, in order to get followers, because you've said the controversial thing, what you think is the controversial thing. But these days, defending the Enlightenment is actually the controversial thing. It's par for the course. It's not really contrarian to say Israel are the bad guys. It's said by a majority of countries a majority of the time, a majority of people in a majority of countries a majority of the time. Actually trying to have a coherent explanation as to why one should actively support Israel, not merely be against Hamas, but actively support Israel. That's the hard part. Be contrarian like that. That's hard to do. But I guess that would be the distinction between being a critical rationalism. You need to use critical rationalism in order to reach that particular conclusion. Well, you don't have to. But yes, critical rationalism is not contrarian. It's not saying that's wrong. Okay, whatever the mainstream view is, that's wrong. It's looking for errors. Looking for errors in things, finding the problems with things, and then conjecturing solutions to them. Okay, so it may be attempting to refute things now and again, but it just not reflexively. Reflexively means as soon as you hear something, you say, no, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. The opposite view is actually correct. Everything you were ever taught in high school about World War II, that's all wrong. Okay, we've since learned better. Hitler's the good guy, or at least he wasn't the only bad guy. Someone who's calling themselves Black has said, I've heard Deutsch make tepid arguments in favour of free will as an emergent phenomenon, yet he also describes how each of the universes of the multiverse is perfectly determined. Can you explain? Yes, I can explain, but I've done many hours on this and written possibly hundreds of thousands of words at this stage on that particular topic. I wrote an article about how free will is an emergent, high-level causative structure. And all that means is that it emerges, okay, it's emergent in the same way that history emerges. And if you're interested in this, just go look for the copper atom argument. It's there on my YouTube channel somewhere or other, the copper atom argument. The copper atom argument is basically about how do you explain the existence of copper atoms in statues of Winston Churchill. And you can either say, well, it's there because the Big Bang happened and physical forces caused over billions of years this particular copper atom to end up where it did. Now, descriptively, that's true, but it's vacuously true. It can be said about anything, anywhere, anytime. It can explain why the bullet that killed John F. Kennedy, why that happened. Or does it? It doesn't actually explain why. It would describe the trajectory of these particles. If you want to explain why the copper atom is in Winston Churchill's statue, then you talk about, well, he was a great hero, coming back to Winston Churchill, and with heroes, we like to build statues of them, and he's a hero because he defeated Hitler in World War II, and we make statues out of bronze, which contains copper because it doesn't corrode away quite so easily, and so these are the reasons why. Okay, so it doesn't contradict the deterministic idea, okay? That copper atom was determined to be where it was. It is a correct level of analysis if you want to understand why the copper atom is there, rather than just say, well, it ends up where it ends up because the Big Bang happened. In the same way, although the laws of physics are deterministic, my understanding of deterministic is just things don't happen purely randomly. Things obey physical laws. So it wouldn't matter what form the physical laws take. You could say the physical laws were probabilistic, so things only probably happen. That would still be determined by the laws of physics, right? The laws of physics determine what happens. Whatever the laws of physics are, it wouldn't matter. So whether or not the laws of physics are quantum or not, whether or not there's a multiverse or not, it is irrelevant to the question of free will. Because what free will is a way of explaining why people do what they do. So you can have a deterministic multiverse, but at the same time within that multiverse have creativity. And creativity allows people to create stuff, which brings new choices into the world. And the example that I always like to use is the nuclear physics. Someone had to discover nuclear physics, create the knowledge around nuclear physics, and then create the knowledge around how to exploit nuclear physics in order to take energy from uranium to boil water and have a nuclear reactor that generates electricity. Now, once you have that nuclear reactor, you then have a new choice on the table. How do we generate electricity? This is the debate that's going on right now. Is it coal? Is it nuclear? Is it solar? Something else? Now, we created all of that knowledge. We created the coal-fired power station, the nuclear reactor, the solar panel. Now, having created it, we've got choices in the world that weren't there before. And so free will, all free will is to me, is an understanding of that, the existence of that phenomenon, the creation of stuff that could not have been predicted ahead of time. We cannot predict the content of our future theories. We cannot predict the growth of knowledge. Someone in 1700 could not have predicted solar panels or nuclear reactors. That's nuclear reactors because they didn't even know what a nucleus was. How could they predict the nuclear reactor? So that the description of that is free will. The creation of choice that wasn't there before, allowing us to choose things that otherwise could not have been chosen before. It's not, it doesn't contradict, violate, have anything to do with determinism. Things are determined in any case. The universe is determined to contain within it creativity and free will. That's all. Free will is not magic, anything like that. That's all it is a description of the fact that choice really exists and people make choices given the knowledge they create. Yeah. But if you think that free will must violate the laws of physics, then fine. I don't think that that can happen. You still, if people want to debate the term, I've also said this before, fine, whatever, okay, so you don't believe in free will. It's almost a moot point. Because the only reason I talk about any of these things is because human beings, people are fascinating. Fascinating. They're mysterious to us at the moment. We are mysterious to ourselves and to each other in terms of why we do what we do. Why do we do what we do? People like talking about their interests and like what motivates them and what they find fun and all of this stuff. So we have this language, but we can't predict what we're going to do because we're creating stuff all the time. We're creating knowledge. We're bringing choices into the world. We're making choices. We're making choices from a repertoire that continues to expand. And so all of that is fascinating. I like talking about that. Now, I like, as a shorthand, to say free will. But if someone says, oh, but we don't have free will, okay, right. Put that to one side. Let's talk about the fascinating enigma of personhood. Create what makes a human special, as distinct from all other creatures. Some people say we aren't, but yeah, so that's it. Someone has asked, are hedge, VC, private equity funds epistemologically sound, epistemically sound? I don't know what that means. I'm afraid, C-hash. I don't know what epistemically sound would mean in that case. If you've got private wealth, if you've got wealth saved somewhere or other and it's being invested, what's wrong with that? I don't understand the connection there. These are methods of generating wealth, keeping wealth in a place and then putting it in places where you think it might grow. Someone has said, comp science said, I'm struggling with the philosophy of Nassim Taleb and the philosophy of David Deutsch. I can't help, that's not a question, but Nassim Taleb, I don't know. I have increasingly lost respect for him. He's taken the wrong side in the Israel-Palestine thing, for example. I don't think he understands very well the Enlightenment. I think that when I did read The Black Swan, that's what it's called. I only read one of his books. I wasn't that impressed, but that was because I'd already read Deutsch and I'd already read Popper. And so upon coming along to Leb, it was like Popper light. Yeah. Muran, historicity is meaningless. The transatlantic slave trade dwarfs Jewish suffering, yet any suffering is wrong. The Israel-Palestine conflict, born of centuries-old tensions, is bound to cause problems. I don't think it's useful to try to weigh up who's suffered more. I don't think that, and like it's like that thing of is slowly torturing one child worse than quickly torturing 50 adults. We can't measure suffering, so I don't agree it dwarfs Jewish suffering. But as soon as anyone says this kind of thing, as I'm reading here now, you immediately know, I immediately know what's behind it all. It's the pattern. The pattern has come up again. Okay, so here I began with a half-hour tirade on the treatment of Jews. And of course, the pattern means that what will come back to me is people excusing, minimizing, legitimizing the suffering or the hurt against Jews. This person has explicitly said, you're basically saying, you've talked about Jewish suffering, but you haven't mentioned transatlantic slaves. This is what happens. There you go. It's going on to say, I don't agree with the aggressions against Israel, but it's disingenuous to compare the entire Palestinian people to Hitler. This is something Douglas Murray has also encountered. Why did you say this? I never said that. I didn't say the entire Palestinian people were Hitler. Quite the opposite. I would say Hamas is worse than the Nazis for the reasons I outlined. They celebrate attempts at genocide and killing Jews. The Nazis didn't do that. So by that criteria, Hamas is worse than Nazis. Nazis didn't celebrate the genocide. Yeah. Let's keep going. Yeah, this person is suffering from the pattern. Obsessed with me talking about Jewish suffering. And so, again, as soon as someone says this, you automatically know what is motivating their utterances. They've been brought up in a culture where they're told colonialism evil. They're told there's something deeply flawed about the Enlightenment Western culture. They feel guilt. One of the great analyses I heard of this recently, again by Douglas Murray, in attempting to explain this phenomenon of young people in particular and a certain kind of person in the Western world, Europe, England, UK, America, Australia, is we are taught, use the Australian example, the UK is taught, people in the UK are taught, feel guilty for the colonialism. The UK was this terrible colonial power. They went out and they conquered all of these countries from India to Australia to America. They wiped out native populations. This is the story that we're told. So you should feel guilty. You inherit this guilt if you're from the United Kingdom. In Australia, you inherit the guilt of the treatment of Indigenous people in the past. In the United States, you inherit the guilt of the treatment of the Indigenous Indian Americans, and so on, across the Anglosphere and Europe more broadly. So what do you do about this guilt if you're a young person and you're animated to try and make amends? Well, there's nothing you can do because those people have long since passed. Okay, that was generations ago, centuries ago. Okay, the colonial project about a century ago in the United Kingdom, a century plus ago in Australia, the treatment. So no one alive today is responsible for whatever evil happened in the past, if indeed we describe all of colonialism as evil, and there's an argument for, let's spread the Enlightenment. But yes, okay, so granted atrocities in the past. Douglas's great insight on this was, well, if you want to make amends for that, what better way than to direct all of your guilt, all of your animus, all of your hatred that you're supposed to feel for yourself, for which you can do nothing, and your own culture for which you can do nothing, because you can't bring back those people that were killed by the evil colonial forces. What better thing to do than to direct it all, scapegoat style, into a hatred, a singular hatred of Israel and a minimization of the hurt of Jews? Israel serves as like this bucket, this receptacle, into which people who have guilt, white guilt as it's often called, Enlightenment guilt, colonial guilt, you can direct all of that, you can throw it into the bucket of Israel and say, I might not be able to do anything about the atrocities committed by my culture, but I can damn sure tell the world that I am a holier-than-thou person. I'm a virtuous person because I am critiquing Israel, because I'm claiming that they're doing that now. I'm claiming that they're the colonial project. Of course, as Douglas points out, that's the most ridiculous thing to claim, is that Israel's the colonial project, when Iran is the one who has more colonies around the world than just about anywhere now. So, yes, there's that. Okay, something here about David Deutsch and Taleb's philosophy. Yeah, Nassim Taleb, he does tend to hold his ideas immune from criticism. I agree with that. The way I think I've long since muted him on X. There's certain people that I just mute. I don't block people, I mute them. It makes your feed a lot more easy to live with. And negativity isn't something that I like. And he was a very negative person. Whenever he'd get into a conversation with people, it would immediately degenerate into a flame war, and I don't want to see that. So, yeah, my interpretation was that his bluster, his rapidity to anger, his discourtesy, his swearing and insult, it's all a way of holding immune his own ideas from criticism. That's what people would do. You just go into a slanging match and insulting someone, well, you don't have to talk about the issue or whatever they've just brought up. You can just avoid that. Someone has said, I am struggling with the below text from Taleb's books. please help me understand. Okay, we might come back to that. We'll see. Someone has asked, isn't the rise in support for kids identifying as trans, including provisioning them with hormones and surgery, sign that we as a society are taking children more seriously to negative effect? I don't think so, because in these situations, it is unclear at the moment that the children have had the opportunity to learn themselves what the content of their mind actually is. They are being coerced. They're not being taken more seriously. The opposite. That's the point. For example, if the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old comes to you and is a boy and says, I'm going to be a girl, and you put them before puberty onto these puberty blocker things, these hormones, or they have a surgery or something, if you tell the child, as has been happening, if you tell the child, this is all reversible, you can make this choice today, and don't worry, if you decide to change your mind and you want to go back to being a boy next year, you can do that. Magic. Well, not, they don't say magic, but that's what they're being told. In other words, absolute lie. Absolute lie. You cannot change your biological sex. The children are not being told that. They're being lied to. Now, as I said in my conversation with Peter Bukosian about this, and I won't, again, rehash all of that right now, the mind is infinitely elastic. No one denies, in the Popperian world, no one denies this. We're universal explainers and so on and so forth. You can dress however you like, present however you like, whatever. But our mind is running on a very real piece of biological hardware, the human body, which is not infinitely malleable. It's not. Our level of medical, scientific and technological progress on trying to do almost any kind of medical intervention is so primitive. So we're cutting into people in order to... Maybe one day, if you're born a boy and you decide you want to be a girl, it can happen, because we'll have AGI robot-type bodies you can put your mind in, and everyone will probably want to do that anyway, because the AGI will never die. Or the AGI robot will never die. It'll have a heart that will last basically forever with a little bit of maintenance. At the moment, these things, these meat bags that we wander around in are primitive, fragile things, hit by a bus, you're dead. What if one day, you're made of, reinforced titanium alloy steel thing, such that the only thing that's going to stop you is a direct nuclear blast. That's an ideal. And at that point, gender won't matter. The mind does not have a gender. The brain does, the body does. And so are we taking children more seriously? Is it the case that when a child comes to you and says, Dad, I know I was born a boy, but now I want to be a girl by chopping off my penis and taking hormones, if what you're supposed to do, and if what the medical profession is doing, is saying, let's affirm that. Okay, again, this is anti-Popperian, right? You don't affirm, you critique, you criticise. You take seriously this idea about what the child really wants. Now, that's not to say that you're denying anything about them. It's not to say you're not taking them seriously, but you want to understand them. Common problem solving. Because not only one person in that world. It's not only the child isolated in the world. So yeah, it's such a pointless, silly issue as well, to one degree. Like, it's just so ridiculous why anyone's talking about this. And the only reason I would ever talk about it is specifically for that reason, because children have been lied to. And I think that's abhorrent. Okay, so... just scrolling through. To the fellow who has asked all about Nassim Taleb, thank you. I won't be able to get to it today. It's just, there's too much there. So I'll read through it later on and consider it. Isaac has asked, hey Brett, sorry if this is out of context, I just got here, but do you have any thoughts on the upcoming Aussie elections, political situation? Do you have a criteria for choosing who to vote for? I know this sounds too clever by half, but as I often say, we don't vote for anyone. Popperian style, we vote against. So it's always lesser of two evils. We come from the philosophy that I don't want leaders, I don't want authorities, but here we are. Here we are. We exist in a world where we have authorities. And we exist in a world where democracy is the worst of all forms of government, except all of those others that have been tried from time to time, as Winston Churchill said. So we're in a circumstance where we have to have authorities because there's a whole bunch of reasons. And we elect authorities via democratic process. But that process of election is actually a process of removing the rules and rulers that you disagree with. And so in this election, for me, one of the major things is clearly inflation is very, very high here in Australia. I think higher than anywhere else. In the Western world, perhaps. I don't know. We're told these things. Anyway, it's high. But also energy policy is that really animating me. Like, I mean, it has gotten so ridiculous that it's hard to conjure language that is sufficiently strong to explain this. As I've said before, and I've done entire episodes on this, Australia sits atop coal reserves second to none around the world, just about. Okay, maybe Russia, some other places. We have a lot of coal. Thousands of years worth of coal reserves. Lots of uranium. Lots of gas. But what do Australian politicians want to do? Well, on one side, the present government says we are migrating away from all coal. We are migrating to wind and solar. Now, if the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, what do we do? Well, we have batteries. Well, batteries have a lifetime of 10 years. What do? Well, we recycle them and they go into landfill, and so there's chemicals. And I thought the whole point was to be good for the environment. These people, I don't find serious when it comes to what the point of energy is. The point of energy is to drive an economy, the point of which is to generate wealth, the point of which is to create more knowledge, to protect us from problems that are unforeseen. We want to be as wealthy as possible. I am for building more coal-fired power stations. Unfortunately, there is no such party that is on the landscape offering that. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And so Australia has a severe energy shortage. They've talked about brownouts and blackouts being in our future because there just won't be enough electricity out there, because they're shutting down the coal-fired power stations, the only thing that provides baseload energy. And so because of that, there's no possible way that I can vote for the Labor Party, who are the ones pushing, we're just going to have solar and wind. That's it, renewables, renewables, renewables. Now, on the other side, the conservatives, so-called conservative side, the best they have to offer is 10 years from now, we're going to have a nuclear power station and a series of nuclear power stations. Okay, that's good. I'm for nuclear power station. But what do you do in the meantime? Well, electricity prices are through the roof. Well, we're real risk of running brownouts and blackouts. And if any kind of disaster happens to any of the existing coal-fired power stations, we really will be in all kinds of trouble. So in that circumstance, I'm voting against the Labor Party and their potential coalition with the Greens, and all that leaves me with is having to put a 1 next to the Liberal National Party. And it's on that basis basically alone, because I think it's the most existentially threatening thing. Energy affects the economy, it affects national security, it affects everything. Cost of living, I wish more people in Australia understood this. Everything comes down to energy. And if we just had a proliferation of coal-fired power stations, your electricity bill would go down. And if you're worried about the environment, Australia building another 10 or 20 coal-fired power stations will not affect climate change, because China's already building a coal-fired power station every week or two. And India's doing something similar. So Australia adding a tiny drop into that ocean has no effect. So why are we impoverishing ourselves while China is allowed to enrich its own citizens? It's absurd, it's absurd, anti-Western, anti-Enlightenment thinking. Not to say that I'm against some amount of solar. I think wind's pretty pointless. But solar, great. Yeah, people have solar panels on their roofs, and that's all great, as long as they're paying for it themselves, but they're not, the government, a whole bunch of issues I could whinge about. So that's it. Fast and Enlightened Man says, do you have thoughts on the relationship of ethics, suffering, personhood, information processing. Well, yeah, on all of those things and the connection between them, but I wouldn't say, I'm not one of these people who says that morality or ethics is really the rules that you have in place in order to ensure your morality, which is a something deeper, a deeper theory or explanation about what you should do. And ethics says, this is what you should do, and if you don't do it, then that's right, wrong, evil, good. I'm not one of these people who says that suffering is the basis of morality, or in some way is the foundation, that suffering is always and everywhere evil, and that's where you have to begin. I don't think you have to begin anywhere. I think just as in physics, what we're doing is solving problems. And a critique of many moral theories or of many policies is, well, it's going to increase suffering. Okay, so that's a critique of that. We don't want to increase suffering. We don't want to. But if you're always everywhere going to try and minimise suffering, that's a bit of a problem, because that could lead some people to interpret that as a kind of pacifism. There might be less suffering if you just refuse to ever go to war. I think it was coming up on X the other day on Twitter, people talking about how they're anti-war. And it's such a simple triviality, vacuous, sort of pathetic attempt at seeming virtuous by saying you're anti-war. You shouldn't be anti-war. If war is brought to you, you better be pro-war. You better want to go to war with them, or you'll be wiped out, you'll be killed, or you'll be kidnapped, or your society will be destroyed. There are certain good wars, namely the wars that you have to take part in order to protect your own civilization. What you should be is anti-war of aggression. Okay, a war of aggression is one that you initiate. Don't initiate war, don't start the war. Okay, Hamas initiated a war of aggression. So what did Israel do? Initiated a defensive war. That's a good war. The Allies initiated a defensive war against Hitler, and so on. So you can't just be anti-war. Imagine being anti-war during World War II. Okay, anyone can say, though, I don't like war. Of course, no one likes war. That's not the issue. As for personhood information processing, yeah, well, yes. A person is a universal explainer. A universal explainer is a form of software. It's a form of information processing. It happens on the hardware of the brain. So yes, yeah. Okay, I'm going to skip past the stuff on Judaism. Talked about that enough. What do you think is the best approach to the paradox of tolerance in countries like the UK and Australia, which are passing legislation ostensibly to fight intolerance while also trampling freedoms? Yeah, I don't think there's no such thing as a paradox of intolerance. It's called that. I wonder if Popper used that phrase. I'm not sure. In any case, it wouldn't be a paradox. We shouldn't tolerate the intolerant, which is not a paradox. It's just it's common sense. If someone is being intolerant, such as the Nazis, then you shouldn't tolerate that. Now, that's very different to having legislation about speech. Legislation about speech is always and everywhere a bad idea, because free speech is a means of error correction. Now, you might say, oh, someone's being intolerant when they say, redheads are ugly or something like that. Now, it might be unpleasant, but it's not intolerance of the form where we're about to go out and start killing people. If you were to say, let's all go and kill the so-and-so, then that's intolerance, and we shouldn't tolerate that. Okay. Again, this is not it's sort of common sense, where you just accept that initiating violence is bad. Calling for violence is bad. That's what we would say about that. So that's the form of intolerance. Joe, Brett, have you been following any other theories outside of critical rationalism, like the Atvian cancer episode, or behaviour passing, or language being 2 million years old, etc.? I'm not sure what that means. I think Atvian, atavistic, or is that different? I don't know. Behaviour passing. I don't know that much more progress has been made on any of those things. Like the atavistic cancer thing, we talked to Charlie Lineweaver about this, wanting to assist him with experiments to test the theory, but so far no luck on that. It's difficult. So I know for a fact there hasn't been any advances made on that. Behaviour passing, I suppose there could be advances made on that, but I haven't heard any. Yeah, so no. Language being 2 million years old, yeah. Well, yeah, I imagine language is very old. Like, after all, at least 2 million years old. Chimpanzees have language, dolphins have language, whales have language. I imagine language is much older than 2 million years, given that other animals who've been around much longer than human beings, use language. Tornado Eye. How do you think American democracy fares against Popper's criterion? Feels like the recent policies by Trump are going to be very difficult to remove. In fact, they're very easy to remove. Like, I have talked about this before at length, comparing, rank ordering different democracies, because you rightly say that a measure of a democracy is the measure of how easy it is to remove bad rules and bad rulers. But no, this idea of, I don't like the idea of executive orders. That's just one thing, because they're by fiat. But they're eminently Popperian in a sense, because as soon as Trump leaves office, the next president can remove them. Now, if the next president's Republican, maybe they won't, especially if they're a MAGA-flavoured Republican. But a Democrat, just as Trump did with Biden's executive orders, a lot of them, he just rescinded them. Immediately you change the president, you change the executive orders. So why would they be very difficult to remove? I see nothing that's changed in the American political system that would say things are now harder because of Trump. The Congress still can remove laws. The Supreme Court can interpret a law in such a way that it can't be enforced or to say it's unconstitutional. So all of that is the same. What I do tend to think is that presidential systems are less democratic as a rule, so the French, the United States, than Westminster systems like exist in the UK and Australia, because the power of the executive is diluted, is so much more diluted. The Prime Minister of the UK or of Australia, in proportion to the rest of the government, has much less power than what the President of France has over the French legislature, or the President of the United States has over the Congress, and so on. So that's, for me, a problem, because it just makes that system it makes it difficult to remove the president. If the president does something wrong, or something that people disagree with, you got to go through this whole legal process that takes forever. In Australia or the UK, you just get rid of the Prime Minister like that. I mean, the party gets routinely, sometimes too often, as people complain. But by that measure of democracy, how hard is it to remove rulers? It's much easier to remove rulers in Australia and the UK than it is in the United States or France. CompSci, no. CompSci is asking what I think about. I'm going to have to move through these very quickly because it's dinner time here in Australia. Hey Brett, I'm curious what you think about law of attraction. People support it with quantum mechanics with the explanation that consciousness affects the double slit experiment. No, just go to my series about the multiverse on YouTube about this. Read chapter 2 of The Fabric of Reality, called Shadows by David Deutsch. And there you will see that consciousness has no role to play in quantum mechanics. That's a misconception. This law of attraction thing, no, that's a pseudoscientific idea. So no. Those three things have nothing to do with each other. The law of attraction, quantum mechanics, and consciousness. My thoughts on 27% of 17-year-olds having ADHD diagnosis. Well, perhaps that is a correct statistic, that 27% of people have been diagnosed with that thing, but that doesn't mean that they really do have it, or that particular condition is in some way detrimental to people, or that everyone doesn't have it to some extent, and all that kind of thing. One moment. Tornado Eyes said, tariffs are intrinsically very difficult to remove once industries rely on them. No, that's not the measure of democracy. We're not talking about whether or not something is politically expedient for a particular government to remove. It could be very unpopular for someone to remove them. The difficulty of removing under Popper's criterion is a legal one. Can they legally change? Now, Trump can do all these sorts of things, but legally, it's easy for the next president to undo them by executive order. Now, whether or not it's easy emotionally for them, whether or not it's easy for them in terms of hoping to win the next election, that's another matter. But that has absolutely nothing to do with Popper's criterion. Popper's criterion, the ease is the legal ease. Is it legally easy to do this thing or that thing, according to the Constitution, the law, custom and practice, and all that sort of thing? That's what we mean. Someone's asked, which book by Popper do you recommend people read after The Open Society and Its Enemies? Now, I often get these questions about what should I read, and I don't know. It depends entirely upon your interests. If you were interested enough to read The Open Society and Its Enemies, maybe you'd be interested in Conjectures and Refutations, but that contains far more historic accounts of science, which is one of the reasons I love it, because Popper deals with scientific problems and the philosophical problems within science, and that's meaty stuff, and so many other philosophers just don't do that. They're not scientifically minded. They do philosophy in the abstract and all this sort of stuff. But perhaps Unended Quest, if you want a book that has a good overview of all of Popper's stuff, and it also has this narrative style, it's his autobiography. That's one. I always like objective knowledge because, like many of Popper's books, it's a selection of essays, and it's a particularly good selection of essays. Someone has suggested Popper selections. Yes. So also that. Basically anything. It depends on what you're interested in. And as many other people say, well, you don't necessarily have to read Popper. You could read Deutsch. Depends on where you are in your journey of epistemology, I suppose. After all, David Deutsch's stuff is the latest, most up-to-date understanding of critical rationalism, Popperian epistemology, that there is. And so you will get almost everything that you would get from Popper in the work of David Deutsch, and then some. But if you go back to Popper if you're really wanting to get into the weeds, details and stuff. I just like reading him because I find him clear, even though I know people say, Popper's not clear and he's too hard. Well, yeah, no, that's because some people aren't used to reading philosophy. If you read philosophy, go and read any other philosophy book, you will quickly realise that the overwhelming majority of philosophy that's out there is dense, hard to read, sometimes nonsense, very difficult to understand, boring. And so when you get to Popper, you realise it's different. It's very different. Okay. Final question. If someone asks, what is the difference between the current AI and a universal explainer, what is a good answer? I was just speaking to someone about this, and there's a lot of ways that you can approach that particular question. One is appeal to disobedience. The more competent a current AI becomes, or any kind of AI becomes, the more obedient it will be by the measure that it will do the thing that you asked it to do without question and without error. On the other hand, a universal explainer must always be able to make errors and disobey you. So that's the criterion for that. One can disobey, one should never disobey, disobedience. The other is, of course, generating novel explanations that actually account for the thing that is out there. AI, LLMs, aren't doing that. They're taking existing explanations and applying them at times in order to generate something, but prepare to be disappointed, as many physicists have, when they ask ChatGPT to come up with a unification of, gravity and quantum theory, and but it's woefully pathetic, coming up with anything that makes any kind of sense whatsoever. They're not generating new explanations. They're not. I'll tell this story again. This will probably come out on one of the other videos I'm about to release as well. I noticed that what was going around on X yesterday was this interesting little example where someone had said, "This is AGI," because many people are claiming that ChatGPT is AGI at the moment, and someone had tweeted out how they'd asked ChatGPT something like the mathematical question, very, very simple mathematical question, 3.11 takeaway 0.3, and it had responded 3.8. So ChatGPT couldn't do the most basic arithmetic problem. It couldn't calculate it. Now, there's many such examples of this. I've done it myself as well. Found ChatGPT unable to do very, very simple maths like that. And so this person was saying, look, here's an example where we can clearly see it's not AGI. But I took away a different message from that. I don't think ChatGPT is AGI, but not for that reason. The reason, in fact, if the system couldn't make that kind of blunder, if it didn't make that kind of error, if it never made that kind of error, it wouldn't be an AGI. Okay, because people make that sort of blunder all the time. They make that kind of mistake all the time. But what are you going to do? Turn around and say when someone makes a simple mathematical error, you're not a general intelligence? You're a dumb AI? No. People make stupid mistakes, silly mistakes. They make mistakes. And so when it comes to ChatGPT not being able to do simple arithmetic, that's not a demonstration. It's not an AGI. It's a demonstration that it's not a sufficiently good AI. A better and better AI is not going to make certain errors. You're going to want to close off particular errors to it, and that will make it a more competent AI. AGI, there is no limit to which kind of errors of what magnitude it makes when. Even if you tell the AGI over and over again, if you try and teach it over and over again to do this thing, it will still make a blunder now and again. A person will make a blunder now and again. Any of us, competent in our own particular domains of expertise, can make simple blunders. That's what makes a person. Whereas the computer system doesn't quite do that. The more that you train the computer, the less it's going to make the same error, and hopefully never make that error again. But the calculator doesn't make numerical mistakes, broadly speaking. I mean, there can be very, 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 very rarely. But you'd say the calculator was broken if it made an arithmetic error. But you wouldn't say that about a person. People can always make mistakes because it is inherent in the capacity to create explanations that you must be able to make mistakes. You must be able to, because you're trying something new. And the overwhelming majority of things that you try won't work. They'll fail. It's called an error. So to be a universal explainer, you have to be an error creator, and then an error identifier, and then an error corrector. But this is not what regular AI does. Regular AI is programmed by people to have the errors taken out of it, and its capacity to make errors reduced to the lowest possible ebb, the smallest number possible. But with people, there is no upper bound on the number or magnitude of errors. Okay, that will do for now. I think this has worked out reasonably okay, and next week, if you're interested, I will be conducting a live stream with hopefully Sam Kuipers, physicist Sam Kuipers, Time Lord Sam Kuipers, as I like to say, quantum physicist who works on the physics of time and expert in the Enlightenment, preparing epistemology, various other things, and fellow of the Conjecture Institute. Now, when exactly that will happen, we will promote on X, on Twitter, and possibly on YouTube, but it will be sometime next week after Easter. It's over, 2025, and so somewhere between Tuesday and Friday of next week, we will figure that out. And then I will be interviewing as many of the other Conjecture Institute fellows as I possibly can. But until then, Go and watch an episode of Talkcast. I put up some recently about the simulation hypothesis and Scott Adams. If you know Scott Adams, that influencer guy, he's a great proponent of the simulation hypothesis, a version of Bostrom's, and I talked about that at great length on Talkcast. That's one of the more recent ones. It's up there. Prepare to see other videos come up again soon, and an interview with Max, the Popperian lawyer, who I spoke to today to talk about how Popperian epistemology can help inform the law. Until I speak to you.